Have you ever thought about what our bones have to say? I mean, long after everything else is gone, the skeleton is still there, holding on to the secrets of a life. Today, we're going to step into the shoes of a forensic anthropologist and learn how to unlock those secrets. All right, let's get into it.
So picture this. You're a detective. This skeleton is your one and only clue. Now, it might look like a total puzzle, maybe an impossible one, but for a trained eye, this skeleton is basically an open book, just waiting for someone to read its story. So where do you even start? Well, you start by building what's called a biological profile. And that whole process kicks off with one really basic question.
Yep, the very first piece of that puzzle is figuring out the sex of the individual. This is actually one of the most accurate things an anthropologist can figure out from bones, and it sets the foundation for every other discovery that comes after.
Now, to figure this out, investigators don't just guess. They have these incredibly detailed charts and observations that point out all the key differences. And these guides tell them to focus their attention on two main parts of the body, the skull and the pelvis. The skull gives you some really strong clues, but as we're about to see, it's the pelvis that tells the most definitive story.
So, just as a general rule of thumb, male skulls tend to be bigger, a little thicker, and just more rugged overall. They've got more pronounced spots where muscles used to attach. Female skulls, on the other hand, are usually a bit smaller, lighter, and smoother to the touch. But to be really sure, you have to zoom in on some specific features.
And this is where it gets really cool, just how specific these differences are. Let's take the supraorbital ridge. That's basically your brow ridge right above your eyes. In males, it's way more prominent. Then you look at the forehead. A male forehead tends to kind of slope backwards, while a female forehead is typically more straight up and down, more vertical. And then there's the chin, usually pretty square in males and more rounded or pointed in females.
Okay, so the skull gets us pretty far, but the pelvis is where we find the most slam dunk evidence. I mean, when the pelvis is available, forensic anthropologists can determine sex with over 95% accuracy. And the reason for that is actually beautifully simple: childbirth.
Think about it. The female pelvis is literally built for pregnancy and birth, which means it has to be broader, wider, and more open. This creates that classic U shape at the bottom. The male pelvis, well, it just doesn't have that biological job, so it's narrower and more compact, which gives it that V shape.
So, the magic is all in the details. The pelvic inlet, that's the main opening, it's kind of heart-shaped in males but more oval-shaped in females. The greater sciatic notch is narrow in males but wide in females. But the real hero feature here is the subpubic angle. That's the angle right at the very front. It's a sharp V in males and a wide, broad U in females. It's just a brilliant illustration of function shaping form.
Okay, so we've determined if the person was male or female. The next huge question for investigators is, how old were they when they died? Now, estimating age is a little more of an art, and it relies on looking at how the skeleton changes and matures over a lifetime.
You can almost think of our skeleton as a living clock, where different parts change at different but predictable speeds. So for kids, checking their tooth development and eruption is the absolute gold standard. But for adults, investigators have to look at other signs, like how the bones of the skull fuse together or even the changing texture of our pelvic bones. Let's start with the skull and see how this works.
Right. So when we're born, our skull bones aren't one solid piece. They're separate plates connected by these fibrous joints called sutures. This is what allows our head and our brain to grow. But as we get into adulthood, these suture lines slowly start to fuse and disappear, essentially knitting the skull into one solid piece. And this whole process happens on a surprisingly predictable schedule. And the fusion follows a really clear sequence. First up is the sagittal suture. That's the one running right down the middle of the skull. It starts to close up between the ages of 30 and 40. Next is the coronal suture, which runs across the front. That fuses from about 40 to 50. And finally, the lambdoid suture at the very back closes between 50 and 60. So by looking at which sutures are open, which are closing, and which are totally gone, an anthropologist can get a pretty good estimate of a person's age.
But what happens if the skull isn't available? Or maybe we just need a second opinion to be extra sure. Well, we can go right back to the pelvis, but this time we look at a very specific spot called the pubic symphysis. This is the joint where the two halves of the pelvis meet right in the front. And believe it or not, its surface texture tells a remarkable story about aging. So in a young person, someone under 20, this surface is really rugged and has these distinct ridges. As they get into their 20s and 30s, those ridges start to wear down and the surface gets a lot smoother. By the time someone is in their 60s or older, that surface starts to break down. It becomes irregularly eroded, kind of pitted.
It's like another powerful clock written right onto our bones, showing the wear and tear of a whole lifetime. So, we've looked at sex and we've looked at age. The last step is to take all these clues, everything from the shape of the chin to the texture of the pelvis, and combine them to build one single coherent story of a person.
Okay, so let's put it all together. To figure out the sex, we look for those rugged clues in the skull and the unmistakable shape of the pelvis. For age, we follow the timeline that's written in the skull's fusing sutures and that ever-changing surface of the pubic symphysis. Each little observation isn't just a piece of data, it's a new sentence in the biography of a person. It lets us build a real profile from what seems like nothing at all.
At the end of the day, it's really like being a detective for the dead. The crime scene, in a way, is the skeleton itself. Every single bone is a clue. And the anthropologist's job is to carefully read these clues and piece together the story of a life that, well, that can no longer speak for itself. Our skeletons are this silent, permanent record of who we are, our sex, our age, our lives. They are the last and maybe the most enduring story we will ever tell. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What story are your bones writing right now?